Welcome back to the Max Out Show, where today I'm honored to talk to one of my own personal superheroes, someone that I've been looking up to for almost a decade now, Dr. Anders Ericsson. Anders is a professor of psychology at Florida State University and the world's leading expert on what it takes to become the greatest in the world in domains such as sports, arts, music, medicine, chess, and many, many more. He's also author of the fantastic book, Peak, the new science of expertise. And that's exactly what we'll talk about today. How to become the best in the world in your chosen profession, the right kind of practice, as he calls it, deliberate practice that you need in order to actually get better and develop new skills, how much rest you need to really recover from those effortful practices, and many, many more practical ideas and tips and tricks, and how you can rise the ladder in your chosen profession and actually develop expertise and skill. So I had an absolute blast shooting this episode. It's always amazing when you meet one of your superheroes and they actually turn out to be, just as amazing or maybe even more than you thought they were. So I hope you really enjoyed. Let's dive right in.
I'm really happy to be here and talk to you.
Now, I'm so excited to have you. And I really want to create lots of paradigm shifts for people here today listening to us and the way that they view expert performance and even their own lives. And I also want to break some myths, bust some myths around what it really takes to become great in life. So first I want to get started with what you call the gift. And, for our listeners, that is not, innate talent. It's not intelligence. It's not raw athletic skill. So can you share with us a little bit about that gift that all of us possess that allows us to actually become better at the things that we care about?
Yeah, I think when we started analyzing and studying people who really excelled at what they were doing, we could find, that they weren't born with these characteristics, but it was actually something that they actively developed and shaped by engaging in the right kind of practice. And I guess our claim is that anyone has, this potential for changing and improving what you're doing at pretty much any age. I guess the one thing that we would have to say, though, that there's no magic. Anybody who's looking for magical potions or basically secret formulas, what you find is it's a very extended process. Even those people who everyone would agree are just really remarkable and outstanding in what they can do, once you start looking at how they became able to do that, it's a very long journey.
Yes, I love that. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper later into what it really takes, what kind of practice, how long, how much, how do we do that, right? But first of all, what are some of the changes that go on in the brain as we develop mastery in our field?
Well, it depends on what type of expertise we're talking about. I guess in many sports like running, the brain is going to have to change, but it's also your muscles, and you can actually see that the very best runners, their hearts have actually adapted to, so that it's able to pump out a lot of blood. And I think a lot of people know that athletes, when they're resting, their heart rate is not, around 70. It could be as low as around 30, indicating here that their hearts really don't have to beat nearly as fast just to kind of deal with a normal situation. And when they're competing and their heart is actually going maximal, then that extra kind of ability here to circulate blood, so there's going to be oxygen to the muscles, that's going to be key. But you can look at pretty much anything except the length of bones, where we know about a process that would allow you now to change those physical characteristics with training. So for example, tennis players, their arms that they hold the racket in, it has thicker bones than the arm that is not holding the racket. So the length of their bones in their arms is no different, but the thickness, and the thickness is actually being kind of stimulated by the vibrations that you get anytime when you hit the ball very hard with your racket. And that now translates into a process that activates basically genes that then regulate the growth of the bone, so they will actually vibrate less as you're adapting now to this type of stimulus.
Well, that's so interesting because, I mean, what this really means is that, other than height, we can pretty much change and adapt and really improve any kind of characteristics, any skill that we want to acquire in our lives, right?
Well, to be safe here, I would say I have yet to find any compelling evidence that there are such things. But as a scientist, you can't really
Yeah.
speak to, what could possibly be uncovered. But I think it's surprising now that people have been looking for those kinds of things that you really can't change for at least the last 30, 40 years. And in my reading of the literature, I'm really surprised to find that, nobody has been able to pinpoint something that, there wouldn't be a kind of training that would allow you now to modify it.
Yeah, no, absolutely love that. Now, you mentioned before that adaptation of the human mind and body requires practice and the right kind of practice. And you have this great quote that says, living in a cave does not make you a geologist, right? And I absolutely love that. So what kind of practice is really necessary to actually become better rather than just stay at the same level?
Well, I think the general description would be to set a goal so you are really setting a goal that's outside of what you currently are able to do. And maybe we could just use the example here of running. So you're running, say, a 10K or something, and when you do your best, you're basically now running at a given time. So the question is now, what do you need to do here to be able to reduce the time that you will be able to run that race? And there's been an accumulation about, what kind of practice really makes a difference. And it doesn't seem to be as important that you basically just run a lot. In fact, the focus needs to be on you pushing yourself at your limits. So interval training, where you run as fast as you can for about 100 meters, and then you're totally exhausted. You get to walk for maybe 15, 20 seconds, and then you run maximally again. And what's interesting is that most amateur runners find that activity is very aversive, because it's sort of pushing yourself against your own limits. And I would argue that those people who do it, I think you could get used to preparing for that type of training. But it's also the case that once you're committed to a goal, you're much more willing now to do what needs to be done in order to make these improvements.
Yes, absolutely. I love that example. I told you before I was studying at Florida Gulf Coast University, and I actually ran cross country and track and field there. So, that example really hits home. And missed those good old running days. But I find it so fascinating. So what you're saying basically is that you need to have a goal, right? First of all, and then you need to, do some effortful practice. You need to do things that are hard, that are difficult, right? So what other kind of characteristics?
Well, I think when we analyzed the literature, we found that the best thing you can do is to find a teacher that has actually brought people like yourself to the level that you aspire to get to. And in music, they've basically been looking for effective training methods for like 200-300 years. So there's a relatively good understanding of what kind of training would allow you now to be able to speed up certain kinds of movements and get additional control. And it also has to do a little bit with having the right fundamentals. So when you're playing the piano, when you're starting, these simple pieces can be played pretty much in all sorts of different ways. But if you want to basically be on the road here of being basically an international level pianist, you actually have to do it so you will now prepare yourself to have that control as it gets more difficult. So in the beginning, if you actually end up doing it in a very idiosyncratic way, the only way you're going to be able to advance might be actually to relearn the fundamentals so you can now, rely on them for your continued improvement.
Yes, that is so interesting. That really gives sort of broader context to what we really have to do in order to become great, right? And actually, what your research has also shown is that like just years of experience don't actually make you better, right? So simply repeating things over and over and over again, whether you're a doctor, whether you're an athlete, right? Mindlessly repeating things doesn't actually make you better, does it?
Right. No, that's exactly. So I would argue that when you start in a domain, like playing tennis or golf, there's a period when you actually will improve significantly. But when you get to a point here where you're kind of reach that acceptable level so you can play with other people, that's often where people kind of get stuck. And they don't even know what they need to do in order to change. And I think that's the reason why having a teacher who actually have seen other people like yourself will now be able to find kind of appropriate goals that are reachable that will eventually set you on the path of actually improving your performance. But that training is sort of different from the fun aspects of just playing with your friends, because now you actually have to focus in and really concentrate and push yourself to your limits in order to get that adaptation of your body.
Yes, that's really so important to remember, I think, because so many people just, kind of keep doing, keep going out there and just do it, right? They just play a little bit with their friends, or they go for that run, and they think they're getting better, right? They think they're training themselves to actually advance and improve. But what you're really saying here is that like once you've reached that level, it's not enough anymore to just mindlessly practice, right? You have to put that deliberate focus on how can I get better, right? What skill specifically can I improve? And so if we want to do this really over years and decades, and we're going to talk about that later, how big or small do those goals have to be? Like, do you usually set this grand vision for like this is where I want to be in 10 years and then break it down? Or how do you usually approach goal setting?
Well, again, I would point to the teacher as being, so it probably depends a little bit on where the individual is starting, but essentially that's something that is very difficult for an individual to judge if they don't basically, for whatever reason, are really knowledgeable about what it takes to improve in that domain. And that's the reason why we think, argue that look for a teacher, because that teacher with their experience are really going to kind of, one, make it plausible to yourself that given that they've led all these other people, and I wish there was more videos of what these individuals looked like when they started, and actually videos as they got better, so people could actually see, here's this individual, he is the same age as I am, and it took him 2 years to get to that point. And this is kind of what he did in the interim, because that, I think, gives so much more kind of credibility to the project. And I think that's one of the problems with people who want to do things, and then somebody who may be viewed as an expert or whatever just tells them, you really don't have the talent. I mean, what are you going to say? But if you actually working now with a teacher who can now point to these other individuals and also give you a little bit of a sense here of how much change and how long a time would it be required for you now to have these biological changes and changes in technique and everything. And I think a lot of people think of learning, you just tell somebody, okay, do this. But that's very different from now this individual incorporating that change in everything that they're doing. And I think that is something that people really need, I think, to rethink, that it's not just having the knowledge of what you basically should be doing. You have to basically now modify and adapt that knowledge. So once you're often in a real-time situation, that you've now developed the skills so they kind of incorporate that knowledge. And there's actually some interesting work looking at medical doctors who are attending conferences, you know, hearing about all the new things that basically they're recommended. And when they did the research, they found that, you know, these doctors, when they got back to the clinic, they just kept on doing what they were doing.
Wow, that is so interesting. You know, there's a quote I absolutely love by Derek Sivers. He said, if more knowledge was the answer, we'd all be billionaires with perfect abs, right? And I love that quote because well, oftentimes we know, right? Those doctors know, like, hey, that's how I should change my practice, and yet they still don't do it. So what have we found? Maybe are there some key techniques? Is it again mentorship and having a teacher that really allows people then when they, you know, are given that advice of, hey, this is how you do it better. What is sort of the difference between the people that take it and run with it and actually apply it, and then people that just kind of take it and, you know, forget about it like next week?
I think that's a great question. And I think if we knew the answer to that question, that would be very important. And I think with most questions, it's easier to ask the question than it is to answer it. But I think in general, I would argue that those individuals that I find who are somehow really committed to being excellent in whatever they're doing, that is not something that just happens suddenly. I mean, it's almost like something that is kind of part of who you think you are. But it also means that these individuals very often are sensitized now to things that really makes a big difference to them. So like, for example, a doctor who is really keen on trying to improve their surgical outcomes, they would be interacting now with a patient. And when they actually see here that the fact that they were the ones who were given surgery to this patient probably improved the outcome or the probable outcome of that surgery by a significant amount. And I think basically getting that satisfaction here, that you made a difference to somebody else's life, those are the kind of feedback loops that I think, you know, just kind of maintain that motivation and willingness to do the hard things as opposed to the simple things. Because obviously, if you're going to sit down with all your people in your clinic and go through here the 10 new things, and then basically working with each individual and have them now basically understand how they need to change things in order to now really capitalize on those new insights. That's a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's an important point you're mentioning here, which is developing expertise is not like a, you know, 2-night thing, right? It doesn't happen overnight. In fact, it takes many, many years and even decades of our lives. So in 2008, Malcolm Gladwell popularized the so-called 10,000 hour rule, right? Where he said basically it takes 10,000 hours to become a world-class expert. But that's, you know, obviously not telling the full story of it. So how much practice do people actually need? What have you found around, you know, what is sort of the timeline that people actually need to become really world-class level?
Well, our disagreement with Malcolm Gladwell, I guess, would be two things. One, there's nothing magical about 10,000 hours. Not even the example that he cited from our own research. There's really no magical thing here that happens after 10,000 hours. And it really wouldn't make sense here that the cells in your body would actually keep track of how much you've been practicing.
Yeah, and all of a sudden it's like, bam, done.
And in fact, my estimate is that somebody winning a piano competition probably spent more like 25,000 hours of solitary practice. But the even more important thing, Malcolm Gladwell is talking about practice, where he basically refers to the amount of time that the Beatles was playing in Germany as an example. So basically the more hours of playing, basically he felt might be related now to their ability to become successful. Now, when we talk about deliberate practice, we talk about that training that you actually do with the primary intent here of just improving. So it's not like you can more or less play for audiences, because there's a big difference trying to do the best that you can do with your current abilities and the work that you do basically when you're practicing with the purpose of just getting better. And when we talk about deliberate practice, we're talking about that time that you spend ideally under the supervision of a teacher who basically can now guide you as to what is the more appropriate training that you can do once you and the teacher have identified, the next set of goals.
Yeah, so this, the theme of like having a teacher, having some kind of mentor in your life seems so important, and really being able to do the right kind of practice, right? So where do you see the balance? Do you think that, sort of competing in whatever it is that you do can ever be really deliberate practice, or is it just like sort of performance, and deliberate practice happens only, off the court when you're, basically alone, just by yourself, no audience, no anything, maybe you and your mentor? How do you see that balance?
That's a very good question. And I think what I would argue, and I'm not sure here that I have the evidence to prove it, competition is obviously critical, because that is the ultimate kind of measure of basically your performance. So if you're great when you're in the practice room, but you basically have all sorts of breakdowns when you're in front of the audience, that wouldn't qualify to be an expert performer. And I think there are a lot of issues standing in front of an audience, and people have pointed out with musicians that pretty much every musician makes mistakes. So in the practice room, you could just stop and redo it, but that's not an option when you're playing in front of an audience. So you actually have to learn techniques now when you make a mistake. So now you change how you actually keep playing, which means that an audience may not even hear that you made a mistake, because you've been able to hide it by basically how you changed the way you were playing. And I would argue that, basically the other issues here of basically what your focus and attention should be when you're performing is sort of a skill that also needs to be trained. So musicians often talk about practice performance, where you're actually performing as if you were to a big audience, but you maybe have just one or two friends or your teacher. But it's essentially, you have the set here of making your best possible performance, which is quite different from that idea of basically, okay, I can do this again and repair this, or I can try to do this, but I can only do it half of the time. So basically that separation between your best performance that you can give at a given point in time and what you need to be focusing in on when you do is quite different from the focus that you would have in the practice room.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's really almost two different skill sets that you need, right? One is really the ability to play, and then the other one is the ability to play when it matters, right? When the nerve's on, when the pressure's on, and all of that stuff. And I can relate to that from running, right? We always, had these pre-season races and preparations, right? Where we'd basically race, but in sort of low key races, right? Where like the pressure wasn't as high as an actual race, but would basically allow us to adapt, like mainly mentally, right, to the rising pressure, to running in front of fans and audiences and all that stuff. And what it allowed us to do was then, basically take more of our potential in those moments where it mattered and really maximize that. So I totally agree with what you're saying, Harry. I love that.
Yeah, I think you would have that in pretty much all the domains that we looked at. Now, we've been interested in those domains where you actually can measure individual's performance and make sure that this is something that an individual can do repeatedly at a level that's better than other people. So the problem, I guess, is that there's a lot of things that happen in our society where somebody does something amazing, but we don't know how much luck was actually involved in this, because it's not like that person is doing that same thing on the football or basketball court, again and again. They did it once, and basically that's amazing. And I think, a lot of the famous basketball players point out that they make a lot of mistakes, but typically when people remember them, they would remember these more amazing things that they did in a particular game.
Yeah, and what is really, resonates with me is that if you want to develop mastery, it really takes just the ability to do something over and over and over again, right? It's not just this one-time shot, like this one lucky thing that you did once, but true expertise and mastery means that you've gotten to the point where you can consistently show up day after day after day and bring basically your peak performance again and again, rather than just, Monday maybe, and then, in 2 months maybe if you have a lucky day, right? But it means this consistency.
Exactly. And I guess I like the word control.
Hmm.
So I would argue that the expert, they can do a lot of different things and they can do it very reliably. Less skilled individuals, they kind of try to do their best and it's almost impossible for them to reproduce what they just did. We actually did a study where we compared basically expert pianists with people who were amateurs. And we just asked them to play the same piece. So they first played it, and then we told them, play it exactly the same way a second time. And only the experts were actually able to reproduce exactly what they did, whereas the amateurs, they just did it again, but they didn't have that control where they actually knew what they had done that, they would need to reproduce.
Okay, so having that sense of control, you can do something again and again. That is really important.
Right. And you can also, as a musician, you can kind of think about what you want it to sound like. And now you can then implement that in the way you're playing. And by actually listening to what it sounds like when you're playing, you can now see whether you were successful in actually making that image that you had. A lot of less skilled musicians, they don't have those abilities of, like in their mind, create a sound experience for the audience and then basically translate that into what they need to do. And then also actually being able to monitor, especially during training, where they're actually making adjustments to, be able to actually deliver that, image that they had of the music experience that they initially generated in their mind.
Yes, so if I'm understanding you right here, it's also those mental representations that you develop through, just practicing deliberately. Those also help you sort of judge more how well you're actually doing, right? So in running, for example, the better I become, the more I train, what I realized is the more I could actually judge my performance on a daily basis. The more I know, hey, today I'm really running at my best, or maybe I'm not, right? And like, what is it like? I feel like you become more distinct. Is that something that you really, also found in other fields?
Yeah, and I think there's some early research that I thought was quite interesting. So they asked, I think this was marathon runners, what they were thinking about during the marathon. And the less skilled individuals, they were just trying to think about something nice and just get through it.
In the end, the beer.
Right. Whereas the really skilled ones, they were really listening to their body, because that's the way they would be able to maximize now their running efficiency and pace themselves appropriately so they would be able to, complete the best possible run. And I think what you were talking about, the running of actually assessing, I think if you're sensitized to what it feels like when you now have your best form, that basically is now something that you need to once acquire, but also then you can use it as a way of helping yourself, get closer to that. And if something happens, like weather changes, you can now make adjustments that maximizes your ability here to perform, even though you might actually have to run a little bit differently because it's much more slippery or something.
Yes, and that's another important part, right? Which is that when you're an actual expert in something, then outside circumstances don't have as much of an influence anymore on your performance, right? So the weather might be bad, right? There might be uphill, downhill. You might have a little injury, or you might have some I don't know, headaches or whatever it is, right? But you're not going to be as influenced by that as someone else that hasn't developed the level of mastery, right? And what I'm thinking also is Michael Jordan's flu game, for example, right? Like he was able, just being totally physically sick, still able to perform better than anybody else because he had developed this practice so much that even when he was at his lowest kind of thing, right, he was still able to perform, whereas others would have just, lied at hospital or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And I don't know that I'm aware of too much research on people who performed when they were sick. So that's hard for
No,
me
I guess
to
that's a very rare
but
example.
I agree with you that is sort of interesting. But unfortunately, I guess I don't really know what exactly was happening with his body and in what sense he was doing things differently. But I do know that if you're talking about musicians that come to a music hall that has different acoustics, they can now change how they're actually playing their musical instrument to kind of adapt and try to maximize now kind of the sound that they're producing. And in the same way that a tennis player, when the wind is going one way or the other way, they can adjust how they're hitting, because they actually have acquired skills dealing with these things, of actually controlling now of how they would kind of deal with basically wind. So that's kind of part of their skill of being able to make those adjustments. In the same way that a golfer, if basically you have had rain in the morning, so the greens are much wetter and slower, he would be able to adjust now how he's actually putting, given now his skill set. Whereas, a less skilled golfer may only really have one putt that they can call upon, and it's going to be quite variable, because we know that if we ask golfers to execute the same putt 10 times, the experts, it's quite clustered. So they're actually able to reproduce that same putt the same way. But when you give the same task to less skilled golfers, it's going to be far more variable, indicating here, a much more reduced control. And then basically, once you have the control, if you can now make adjustments to it because of external conditions, that's how you can deal now with the fact that basically it's going to require, physically speaking, a different kind of energy hitting the golf ball to get the best possible result.
Wow, that's just so mind-blowingly interesting. Now, I'm really curious to hear your take on the kind of focus that it takes. And so what I mean by that is, personally, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. So I'm, working full-time, studying full-time, running semi-professionally, trying to build this podcast and, business basically, and also trying to have some social life, right? And so I'm trying to, basically excel in these 5 areas of my life, all at big level. And what I've realized is, it's just not possible, right? At some point, something has to, sort of give in, right? Because there's just limits in terms of, time and energy that we can take on every day. So I had to decide to give up running so I could do the things that would actually sort of fulfill my life's purpose. But I'm really curious to hear your perspective on, how do we handle or balance those different aspects of our lives? Like, is it possible to succeed at multiple areas at the highest level, or do we need that monumental focus on this one thing, playing the violin, learning the sport, to really become world class at that?
I think this is a great question, and looking at those people, but that's obviously kind of a select group that makes a commitment out to compete in the Olympics, or basically play as an international soloist, or basically playing chess or whatever. In those cases, those individuals, because I guess that's one issue that an expert encounters immediately, is how do you basically make a living, because very few people would actually be paying for you spending 4 hours a day practicing running. Now,
Not a
once
very
you get
useful
to
thing for the world, yeah.
a lot of successful people, they would have sponsors, and maybe other people would have parents or other individuals who would be able to kind of sustain them. But if you look at like one group which is interesting is authors, really famous authors. what they would tend to do is a difference now between when they're actually writing the book. They would typically now move to a place where they would have much more control over social life. So they would basically be maybe writing 3-4 hours in the morning, and then the rest of the day they would be more or less just kind of relaxing, and they, that might be a good time to socialize with other people, and then they would make sure that they would get enough sleep. And I guess one sign that I think is interesting is if you can wake up by yourself in the morning without an alarm clock, that's typically a sign that you've gotten enough rest. And we found with the musicians, that they slept around 8-9 hours. Basically, one of those hours was a nap in the afternoon. But most college students, they sleep considerably less. And my feeling is, ask yourself, what is the most challenging activity that you have? So if you really want to improve one thing, what would that be? And then I would basically engage in that basically in the morning for 1 or 2 hours, and I think that's a little bit, if you're a university professor, you are going to have to give lectures and you have to do this and that. So I think I have about 2 hours in the morning when I can actually do my best work. And then once I've done that, then I can move over to other things where it's not as key, at least not in that, during that particular part of my career, that I excel in this and that. But thinking about, what is it where you really need to be at the edge of your current ability? And ideally, if you're working with a teacher, what are the things that you're now able to modify and improve?
Well, there's really so much interesting stuff here that I want to dissect a little bit. So first of all, the sleep example is just so interesting, I think, because many people, I know so many people that wear, lack of sleep almost like this badge of honor, right? They're like proud, oh, I only sleep like 4 hours a night, 5 hours a night, right? But what you're really saying is here, you actually detrimentally influence your ability to perform at your best and to get better and to build new skill sets when you don't sleep enough, right? And that is so powerful, I think, for everyone listening to this, to just think about, really, are you getting enough sleep on a daily basis? Because if you're not, you may be studying 10 hours a day, but it's not going to be as effective, right? And so I think,
and that's why it's so important here to be able to almost, and you could do a self-experiment where for a week or two, you're actually now changing how you're doing things, and hopefully then you would be able to evaluate. So those 2 or 3 hours in the morning when you're actually working on this thing that is really key for you to basically make progress right now, is that progress getting more than when you did it the other way? And I think, some people who don't sleep enough, they're pretty much not very effective until lunchtime. And then basically, if they're going to be doing some really challenging work, they often end up doing it just before they go to sleep. And basically, I think that is, or at least I haven't found examples of people who do it that way, who have the option of doing it some other way. Now, if you were forced to make a living here for your family or whatever, to work 8 to 5 and then add another hour travel time, when would you be able to work on basically the thing that's important to you? Well, that might be at night when your kids are asleep. But that's very different from that person who has more control over when they would be doing things. And, especially if you give yourself a more long-term plan, you can actually make sure now that these 2-3 hours, you're really protecting that, and only, when you absolutely have to, would allow other things to interfere with you spending that, highly productive time for your high priority projects.
Wow, that is really such an important distinction here between having, sort of ideal life circumstances, right, where you can do it whenever you want, and having those sort of outside things like a job, for example. So for me, for example, right now, I usually wake up like before 4 a.m. and do between 4 and 8 a.m., right? That's when I do my practice time, my speaking and all that, because it's the only time I can fit it in and really be cognitively so awake. Um, but I'm really curious to hear about this because, athletic skills, running, for example, there's some obvious physical limits to how much we can practice every day, right? So I can run, 100 miles every week, or I just know I'll get injured, right? But when it comes to these mental pursuits, right, or things that are maybe even less physical, maybe like playing a piano, right, or maybe really cognitively advanced tasks, what do you see sort of as the limit to how much we should practice every day, but still making sure that we can actually do it over, over the long run, over years and decades of our lives, and not burn out?
Well, I've talked to chess players and musicians, and I would argue that they are, very similar to the kind of restrictions I was talking about. So it's very rare to find, very skilled musicians who would be practicing more than maybe 5 hours a day. And typically they would do maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, and then they would basically maybe do something else, and then they would take lunch, and then often they would take a nap after lunch, because that would in some ways be the most optimal way for them to get back to that high concentration, so they could put in 1 or 2 hours of practice in the afternoon. And basically, but I would argue that anyone should be sensitized to kind of the clearness and your ability here to at least reach the absolute highest level that you can. Because if you really want to go beyond that, then obviously you need at least to be able to produce that highest level that you are able to do. And I think that idea that a lot of people have, that when they're practicing, they only have to put in 50%. But essentially, when you ask yourself, what could possibly happen if you're actually doing this thing at 50%? Why would you be now more able to do it under competitive condition? So, I think Michael Jordan was criticized by his teammates when was playing as a professional, because he claimed, during practice, I want to be at the same level that when I'm playing matches, because that's the only way that I can actually get better.
Wow.
But it's interesting, and I think it would be useful for people who are interested to kind of create almost like a little experiment for themselves, to kind of now see whether in fact these factors would make a difference that would benefit them, especially in the long run. Because it is possible to, maybe for 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe even 4, to basically be going 100%. But what happens after that is typically that people almost get fatigued, and sometimes they exhibit almost symptoms of depression, because they are so, had pushed themselves so beyond. So they weren't basically having that routine of making sure that every day your body gets enough time to kind of recuperate and basically get back to a healthy state until you do something to push it even further.
Yes, I agree. I think this idea of overtraining oftentimes comes, especially in athletics, right, comes to bear, because and this has happened so many times to myself, right, where like I was just running so much, I was kind of approaching it like Michael Jordan, right, just going hard every day, like it was, the race of my life, right? And what happens is you burn out, right? Like your body is just so fatigued and you can't keep going anymore. And so I totally agree with you that over the long run, it's not really smart strategy to try to go all out every single day, right? You want to make sure that what you're doing, especially because it takes so much time, is actually sustainable, right? And so you mentioned before your own routine in the morning, your 2 hours. So what does your own, deliberate practice look like? What are you working on? Is it, writing? Is it doing research? And how do you, sort of incorporate those principles into your own life?
Well, maybe I should go back just a little bit, to the time when I was in West Berlin, where we started this work on the violinist. And up to that point, I had been on basically a regular professor with a lot of teaching, a lot of basically other responsibilities. But when I came to the Max Planck Institute, I didn't have any other responsibilities than just doing my research. And I guess I found, that after the first couple of months, I was kind of basically feeling kind of exhausted and was kind of wondering, this is my chance here to really do something, and realizing now this limitation. And one thing that I've been doing, is reading biographies, and I was now seeing how people that I really admired, were really kind of constraining and separating that time when they were really trying to do their best from the time when they were, able to sort of, more just regularly function without kind of really trying to strain yourself. And that idea here that you should almost, and you could take your heart rate now with these watches to make sure here that when you wake up, your heart rate is going to be a reasonable one, and that you're going to feel rested. And if you don't, then maybe you need to adjust something that you're doing. But it is very tempting when you're motivated to want to make that, progress so much faster than it's possible. But anyway, so after that kind of realization, and then when we found the same pattern here with the violinist, I guess I've really tried to adapt my life and making sure here that the most challenging thing that I'm doing, and very often it involves kind of writing papers and trying to think through some issues, either, kind of explaining here some research that we conducted and why those results have some implication, or writing a review chapter. But I would say that that is probably the most challenging activity that I engage in, is that sort of thinking about a new problem and maybe reading other people's papers and trying to figure out how they, fit or don't fit in with the way I was thinking about it. So that's sort of a little bit how my life has been now for a long time. And I found that a lot of, well, or at least several people have told me that this rule that I kind of initiated, where I wouldn't have people scheduling meetings sort of before lunch.
Wow.
So basically, when I was an assistant professor, it's sort of like, you do what people tell you to do. But once you kind of advance a little bit, if people say, okay, we're going to have a meeting, when are you available? When you just give other times, then basically that protected time. And, you shouldn't really even get into this issue, because some people wouldn't really respect it if you said, well, this is my writing time. Well, that's perfectly fine, that we have the meeting then. But basically having a way here of, really kind of getting other people to adapt to your constraint here about when it's appropriate to have a meeting.
Yeah, so it sounds like you really got to become religious about your daily practice schedule, right? To make sure that, like, no matter what happens, no matter who wants something from you, you are actually focused and devoted in that moment, and not thinking about anything else, not doing anything else. So you have that regular practice.
And I think that once you adapt to it, it's actually almost reinforcing. Now, obviously, you have to make exceptions. Sometimes somebody needs your help or whatever, but essentially having that in the same way that some people are as committed to their 9-to-5 job, I'm committed to basically that morning hours for writing and thinking.
No, I absolutely love that. Now, to devote, decades really of your life to any kind of pursuit takes enormous discipline and as Angela Duckworth would call it, grit. So what have you found those people that really stick with it over the long run do differently? And how do you sort of push through those years between year 3 and year 5 when they're getting good, but they're still so far away from actually becoming world class? How do you make sure that when you're really trying so hard for so many years and you're still not there yet, quote unquote, how do you still keep going then?
Well, again here, I think just looking back at my own life and also other people I've talked to, I had pretty early on, and I think this was maybe, when I was starting at the university and sort of thinking a little bit about becoming a researcher, I wanted to find a problem that was big enough that it was going to last me a lifetime.
Wow.
And I guess what I was interested in was essentially in how we can describe people thinking when they're, facing complex tasks, and in particular, how we can understand why some people seem to be able to, generate better solutions to those tasks than other people. And and I think by kind of having that general task, it's sort of like everything I've been doing in much more detail have been subsumed under that general project. And I think that's one of the things about life projects, that it's kind of nice when they, in some ways, it's almost like a tree, you have
Mhm.
a very general trunk, and then essentially as you get further and further away here from that basically trunk, it's going to be, leaves and much more detail. And then so in the last maybe decade, I'm interested in, I guess, working with different people, studying different kinds of expertise, and and I kind of love working with experts. I think experts, they're committed in the same way that I'm committed, and I find, that they're very thoughtful, and also they have a very high threshold for, BS. Uh, so basically, they'll tell you, I don't believe that's not, real. So if you want to convince them, you're going to have to basically work hard now to actually find the evidence that would, really, and compel them to pay attention to what you're saying. And but anyway, I think that idea here of working with people who are experts, and in a sense, they're almost having a kind of a cooperation here between the expert who is somehow pushing, to new limits, and actually trying out to understand here scientifically, understanding what is it that basically this ability here to reach these high levels, what implications does that have maybe for the rest of us in terms of what is modifiable, and what does it take to basically get certain types of changes happening.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think Simon Sinek, I don't know if you know him, amazing speaker and leadership expert, and I think he calls this endless games, right? Something where that you can basically pursue for the rest of your life, and there's never going to be an end to it, right? It really sounds like with the challenges and the problems and the opportunities that are provided in this field, you're never going to run out of stuff to do, out of stuff to discover, and that seems like it's an important part of that, is that there's always something new to discover, always something to grow, to practice, to learn something new.
And I think that's one of I've been giving some talks here to different companies. One of the issues is that a lot of people after the first couple of years, almost kind of settle in sort of a process that, they're not feeling like they're growing and getting better, and they're, almost sort of getting bored. If we could basically make sure now that every person, or as many people as possible, had that kind of life project where in some sense they could really have that sense that they're, learning something, getting a little bit further, and what they're doing is making a difference to other people than themselves.
Yes, that's so important. And I mean, you've made such enormous contribution to this field over the last 30 years now, right? In fact, I've heard it said somewhere there, basically the science of peak performance has two eras: the time before Anders Ericsson and the time afterwards, right? And I absolutely love that, because in a way, it's really true. So my question is, like, what still are the big open questions in your mind? I mean, you've learned so much. We've learned so much over the last decades, but what are still some things that keep you up at night and that you wonder about and research about now? It's like, what is the next thing?
Uh, I think for me, one of the issues that basically has come up how do you basically, if you have one individual who is now engaging in, say, 3 hours solitary practice, how would you be able to kind of tell that that individual now met the kind of assumptions and the criteria that we have for deliberate practice, where you were actually engaging now in goals and you were basically making effort here to solve these things? And then you have another person who maybe does that for 5 minutes and then basically is more or less just playing their instrument for the rest of the time. Because I think that if we're going to help people, actually practice in the way that we're recommending, we have to find some way here of actually giving feedback and finding ways here of monitoring the differences between different people. And that links up a little bit with my original interest here. And, how can we describe what's going on in people's heads when they're thinking? Now, what can we describe about what's going on in people's heads where somebody's actually improving much more than somebody else? And what is the difference? And once we can understand what the difference is, hopefully we'll be able to at least give that individual some insights into what the options are. I think it's going to be very hard to force people, or at least that's not something I'm particularly interested in. What I like to do is to give people options and clarify basically what are the implications here if you decide to do this or if you decide to do that. And I find that some people, it's almost like if they just put in the effort memorizing by rehearsing things, that they believe now that they've generated that understanding and that kind of real genuine processing of the information. I mean, they've basically put in a lot of effort, but what they were doing has not really advanced them into something that is really helpful to them. And if they get a job that, where this knowledge is going to be relevant, it's almost like they never really even were exposed to that information.
Wow, that's so interesting, because it really sounds like, by giving people those options, you also give them the choice to really decide, do I want to play at the highest level, or do I want to, still do a lot of work, but do work that isn't quite on the same level, right? And never actually get there. So I think it's just a very empowering thing for people to realize that just doing work, like just working hard, is not enough if you're not also working smart, if you're not actually applying the right training strategies. Then you're just basically wasting your time, right? And just putting in effort without any results back.
And one thing that I'm really interested in is to encourage people to document their learning history, because I don't think that we really know what's going on in people's heads. And I think some individuals who people call gifted or creative or whatever, if you were basically understanding a little bit more what they were thinking about, you might actually understand now why they are able to, respond in maybe more interesting ways than other people. But that idea here that what you're thinking about and how you're actually thinking about it is actually, a process by which you will shape and change what you can do, versus this idea that, whatever you're thinking is sort of totally unrelated to anything that basically will result from that activity. But I think today it's relatively rare to get these sort of thinking aloud protocols of people. And I've been sort of actually working on trying to assemble some of these. And one thing that I think is kind of interesting, so when you wake up, what is the first thing that you think about? And I would say that basically somebody who is really excited about something, they may be in love with somebody, or maybe they're in love with some activity. The first thing that they think about are going to be related now to things that they want to do. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think some people who maybe would even call themselves depressed, what they're thinking about is all the bad things. Mm. And obviously finding ways here of minimizing the risk. I think you will always be tested and challenged, but I think there are ways here that parents and other individuals, teachers, can actually help students sort of understand a little bit about what other people have faced and how some of the more successful ones, how they actually dealt with it. But anyway, I think there's fortunately a lot of things to be done.
Yes. I heard this quote the other day. It said something along the lines of the ultimate luck in life is that for every mile that you travel, you're 2 miles further away from the destination. And that really, I butchered the quote a little bit, but that really blew me away, right? Like if you're in the pursuit of something where the more you move, the further you actually get away, because the more you realize it's so endless. I think that is such a fascinating thing. Now, one of the things I ask every one of my guests is, I believe that failure is a stepping stone to success. So do you have a favorite failure in your life?
So I personally don't think of failure as failure. So failure kind of, to me, implies that you thought that you're going to be successful. So I have probably tried to live by do your very best, and that's all you can do. And once you've done that, you can sit back and see, what is it that I could have done better? But the fact that, if I interviewed for some jobs, and I guess there are probably a couple like that I didn't get offered, I could say that that's a failure. But I think both of those cases, I felt, I did the best I could, and I think in those cases I was maybe telling myself, it's a mutual thing. I'm not going to be able to change here because you want something that's different from what I am. So basically, part of this is going to be an issue here of match. So it's not a failure. I mean, maybe at least one of those I probably would have been interested in accepting if I had gotten it. But, so in that sense, I don't think of failure, or at least I can't really remember one where, I kind of was convinced or was hoping that I was going to make it and then got devastated when I didn't. I typically, as long as I can remember, have this philosophy of identifying the worst possible outcome and then planning for what I would do if that were to happen.
Love
and
that.
Then I kind of forget about it, and now by just focusing on trying to do the best I can, and that's basically, I don't know anybody who can do better than the best they can.
No, no, I absolutely love that, right? Because once you know your biggest fear, right, the worst thing that could possibly happen, and you're going to survive, like I always feel like that is such a liberating feeling, right? To know that even if I fail, completely at this, if I don't get the job, if I, whatever happens, right, you're still gonna be okay. Like life is gonna go on, and in 2 years from now, you're probably gonna laugh at it. So I love this process, what you're saying.
Yeah, no, that was very important to me, basically, that kind of sense here of having to face it, but then basically accepting it, and then I could just put it aside, because if I have full control over that option, then that's the worst that could conceivably happen.
No, I absolutely love that. Now, before I ask my final question, where can listeners connect with you online, learn more about your work, whatever it is?
Well, I guess I find that I have a hard time answering my emails, so that's about the only thing. And
so we're not going to send that out.
my university has contact information, and I would say that basically anybody interested might go to Google Scholar and see some of my recent papers, or maybe if they haven't seen the book Peak, which I think is at least a very good introduction.
Phenomenal book, yes, for sure. Since you're so reluctantly pitching it, I feel like I have to, because I absolutely love the book. I think it's a total game changer. So,
well, thank you so much.
Of course. Now, my final question, and this is really related to the theme of this podcast. What does mental mastery mean to you?
I think basically that kind of honest attempt of really genuinely trying to understand something in the way basically, but I'm not sure that I would think of this as a state. I think it's more like a process. And at least for me, as I'm reading new things, I think at least it's going to alter some of my understanding. But that's part of what makes the journey interesting. So if I basically had arrived here at
That'd
this
be boring, right?
maximal performance, then, I don't know what I would be doing.
All right, guys, that's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you gained some valuable ideas, tips, tools, tricks, mindsets, belief systems that will hopefully inspire you to take your life to the next level. At the end of the day, guys, it's all about application. The only thing that's going to set you apart tomorrow from where you are today is how much action you take with those ideas that you gained. And so I really want to challenge you at this point to, not just listen to this passively, to not just consume this, passively, just thinking about other things, but to really take those lessons, take those ideas that you just gained and start applying them to your lives, to really start taking action and sprinting towards those goals and those dreams that you have in your life. Now, guys, at this point, I want to ask you for a huge favor. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider heading over to iTunes and leaving a review, as that helps me really grow the show and reach more people, impact even more people around the world. If you have a family member, a friend, a loved one maybe that you think could benefit from this content, please consider, sharing it with them, forwarding to them, as that helps us really build a community of like-minded people that are all about maxing out their lives. Now, guys, with that being said, thanks so much for tuning in today. I really, really appreciate it. Stay strong and see you tomorrow.